Hello, I'm Juliette. I'm a coordinator with the One Democratic State initiative. Today, I'm very happy to speak with Fahad Ansari and Franck Magennis from Riverway Law. They are part of the team of British lawyers who are instructed by Hamas to appeal its designation from the list of terrorist organizations in the UK. So we are going to speak about the case, its resonance within the pro-Palestinian and anti-Zionist movement, as well as how legal action and the defense of one democratic state can go hand in hand. So Fahad, Franck, hello. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for being here. Before we start, can you briefly introduce yourselves?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Fahad Ansari. I come from a place called Galway in the west of Ireland, probably the best place in Ireland. And I'm a solicitor by trade. I'm the director of Riverway Law. I'm a father of 4 kids. And for the past 25 years, I've been doing whatever I can to confront Zionism and stand for the Palestinian rights of dignity and freedom.
My name's Franck Magennis. It's great to be here. I am also from Ireland, the occupied bit in the north. I come from South Armagh, which is a somewhat notorious part of the country. And since 2016, I've been called to the Bar of England and Wales, where I practice as a barrister. So I've been doing that for 9 years, and a lot of my cases over the years have focused on interrogating Zionism in the courtroom and representing Palestinians and anti-Zionist clients.
Thank you so much, and again, welcome. Can you tell us about this particular case?
So I think to understand the case better, it's important that you understand the politics of prescription in this country. So prescription, which in normal English is banning a group, in this country began in the 70s with in the north of Ireland with the Irish groups, primarily the IRA. And to one sense, you might be able to understand why the British government would want to ban groups which were effectively engaged in a freedom struggle against their occupation. But 25 years later, in the year 2000, they decided to extend that prescription politics globally, and they began to ban groups which had nothing to do with British national security or British citizens. So in March 2001, they banned 21 groups, including the LTTE, ETA in Spain, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, the military wing, Hamas's military wing, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and a whole host of others. Now, the prescription itself creates a number of criminal offences that come with it. So whereas previously somebody could say that they were a supporter of the Izzuddin al-Qassam brigades, Hamas's military wing, all of a sudden overnight it became an offence to even wear a symbol that might suggest that you're supportive of that group. It became a crime to invite support for that group. It became a crime to express support. It became a crime to have a meeting with a member of this proscribed group. And effectively, the intention behind this is to dehumanize that group. That it's not allowed for you to understand their motivations or their desires or their reasons why they engage in political violence, because you have you have to accept the version of reality that the British government is informing you of. That's the only version of the truth that you can possibly accept. If you veer from that, you are potentially committing a criminal offence. Now, these prescription offences are so serious that there's no prior judicial oversight. I mean, in a normal due process in a court of law, if you're accused of a crime, you have the right to defend yourself, you have the right to see the evidence, and then if you're convicted, then you become a convicted criminal or a convicted terrorist. Here you have a wholesale application of a smear on a group saying that these people are terrorists. Anybody associated with them are terrorists. So if you are associated with that group or you believe in that group or you support them in any way, you are also a terrorist by implication. To try to soften the blow, the British government at the time they sort of passed this legislation, they said we need to introduce a safeguarding clause which will allow these groups to apply to remove themselves from this list because they recognized how serious the implications were. And that safeguard that was put in, which the government themselves described as an effective remedy to the unfairness, the inherent unfairness, was what's called Section 4 of the Terrorism Act 2000. And this is the means by which any group or any individual impacted by the prescription can apply for their removal from the list. So that's the premise by which we were instructed by Hamas to apply to the British government to remove it from the list of proscribed groups. I think, Frank, you could probably maybe go into the reasons why we brought the case and the grounds we ran.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say something about the context, and then I would provide some a sort of description of the grounds that we've advanced. And it's perhaps obvious by this point to state that the context is astonishing, right? We're witnessing the collapse of an apartheid regime. The fact that it's an apartheid regime is now no longer in doubt, because the International Court of Justice in July last year confirmed that that Israel is in breach of Article 3 of the Convention of the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So it is an apartheid state. There's no basis for doubting it. Its official animating ideology is Zionism. And perhaps before October 2023, Zionism retained a degree of sort of respectability in Western countries. That's completely collapsed. Now I think the average person on the street sees Zionism for the racist, colonial, apartheid and genocidal ideology that it's always been. And so that creates very difficult questions for the Secretary of State, right? If it's right that Israeli apartheid is going the way of South Africa, it raises profound questions about what's to become of, what the territory of Palestine that's currently governed by a single apartheid regime. So that's the context. That's the context in which Hamas is bringing this application to the British Secretary of State, saying, look, your little loyal Jewish Ulster, as it was once called, is in crisis and looks like it might be about to collapse. If that's right, we win elections. We won the only free and fair election in Palestine these last 2 decades, and so it seems sensible that you should talk to us. As to the grounds themselves, there are 3 of them. The first relates to international law, and again, the law is just common sense with bells on. The first ground is all about how people who are being occupied, who are being violently dominated, racially dominated by an illegal occupation, have a right under international humanitarian law to use physical force, armed force to resist that. And that ground also goes into, some of these legal concepts I've been touching on, right? Apartheid, occupation, racial segregation, all the rest of it. So ground 1's about how the domestic proscription regime also relates to international humanitarian law. Ground 2 is primarily about human rights. And it's worth noting that it's primarily focused on the human rights of people in Britain, right? People who want to be able to talk about this important conflict. They want to be able to discuss what a peaceful solution might look like, even if they may not wish to express support for Hamas themselves. What's absolutely clear is that the Terrorism Act 2000 is a full frontal assault on people's ability to talk about this issue properly. And that's ground 2 in a nutshell. It's all this sort of human rights arguments. And it's not just free speech. There are some other human rights arguments in there as well. And we talk in particular in the drafting about dignity, right? Dignity is the foundation of human rights law, and thinking about Hamas and other Palestinian groups as a manifestation of the Palestinian need and right to live in dignity, right? And being herded into a concentration camp like Gaza, kept there for almost 2 decades and told that you're literally human animals is undignified. And that's part of what we get into in the second ground. And then the third ground is all of this practical stuff. Like, what is the practical consequences of prescribing a group like Hamas in circumstances where they did win an election almost 2 decades ago? And the consequence of that is that they form an integral part of the civil as well as the military administration of the Gaza Strip. And so practically, if the British government maintains the prescription, it will continue to be extremely difficult to send any kind of aid, to engage in kind of diplomatic negotiations. There's all kinds of practical ways in which the prescription inhibits things like that. And for those 3 reasons, we've said that the prescription is unlawful and that the current Secretary of State should consider reversing it.
Thank you. It's very interesting to hear about these different, the 3 grounds that you just mentioned. One of the things that we hear sometimes, and one of the questions that is around this is also around specific events like October 7th. Is it part of the case to also discuss whether such events can be designated in a certain way, or is the discussion around the group in itself?
I mean, it would be a bit difficult to address the application of de-proscribe Hamas without dealing with the specific event of Tufan al-Aqsa, or the 7th of October, as it's known in the West. But that's not the be-all and end-all of the application. We're not looking at a specific event and saying, well, because this happened, this group are terrorists. We're looking at a whole-scale understanding of what drives this group, what is its presence in the United Kingdom, does it pose a threat to UK national security, does it pose a threat to British nationals overseas, is this contributing to the genocide by continuing to ban Hamas? So we do address the 7th of October. We do address it in detail. In fact, our client, Dr. Musa Abu Marzouk, has provided a very lengthy witness statement about the events of 7th of October, what motivated the operation, what actually happened according to the Hamas leadership, what the myths of the 7th of October are according to the Hamas leadership. And that's set out in great detail with, it's documented, it's evidenced. We're not asking anybody to believe it or to disbelieve it, but that's our client's account about what happened, and that surely has some weight to be attached to it as one of the key protagonists to this discussion. What we're told in Britain is that you're not allowed access to that material. You shouldn't understand and hear what the other side has to speak. The main broadcaster in this country, the BBC, it took them an entire 12 months before they were able to actually even interview a Hamas spokesperson about what happened on that day. 12 months into a genocide, and then the first time they interviewed Khalil al-Hayya on BBC. Absolutely appalling levels of so-called journalism. So terrorism is addressed, and what's quite important to understand is that the definition of terrorism under the British law is any act of violence that's motivated by political, religious or other ideological drive. That is terrorism. So obviously under that definition, what Hamas are doing in Palestine will fall under the definition of terrorism. So will the actions of the Israeli armed forces, so will the action of the Ukrainian army fighting against Russia, so will the actions of the British armed forces. It covers everybody. The issue is not political violence. The issue is the politics behind that violence and Britain's role in that politics. If Britain is allied with a certain group that is carrying out acts of political violence, it will not describe them as terrorists. It's an obvious point. When it comes to those that it disagrees with, it will describe them as terrorists. So while this application is couched in legal terms, ultimately it is a political decision. And that's why it's very, very important that the politics of this entire situation are not omitted from the discussion and the debate.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, obviously. And the only thing I'd add is that one of the things that gets discussed a lot around October 7th is this question of accountability, legal accountability. And it's always a bit staggering, the hypocrisy and the way in which Muslims, Palestinians and Hamas in particular are held to this a certain standard, all the while the apartheid state of Israel and its administrators, people in Britain don't even, certainly the British government, doesn't even pretend to hold Israel to that standard. And so what ends up happening around October 7th, first of all, of course, we're all familiar with the way that Zionists and their allies in the British state try to suggest that history somehow started on October 7th. And that's October 7th, 2023, and that's convenient for the British because the British have been at this project of creating a little loyal Jewish Ulster, this fantasy of a Jewish colony in Palestine. Like that fantasy has existed in the highest echelons of the British Empire for literally centuries, right? It was early to mid 19th century that idea first started to take root. So it's very convenient indeed for the British Empire to try to pretend that history started, 2 years ago. And as to accountability, what's clear from the application is that Hamas does take accountability seriously. It has internal accountability mechanisms, which it claims to enforce, and it also welcomes external accountability. And that's something that Dr. Musa Abu Marzouk goes into in detail in his witness statements. And I suppose it's worth mentioning, just for the benefit of your viewers, so they understand the application in more detail. They can go to hamascase.com to read all of these documents we're talking about. It's not just pleadings and witness statements by our client. It's also 20 expert reports that go into detail about some of the issues that we're discussing here, including the question of October 7th and its enduring significance.
Thanks. And we will put also the link to this website because I think it will be indeed very interesting for people to go check it. you talked about the fact that this case and the proscription, if I'm not mistaken, this is the word. The fact that the Hamas is on this list is embedded in a political context. Can you maybe share your perspective, or would you say that this case is also somehow a political case?
Without a shadow of a doubt, it's a political case. And it's very, very critical to understand the context behind which Hamas got proscribed in its entirety. So I mentioned earlier that in March 2021, the Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam Brigade, the military wing, was banned. Now, if you cast your mind back to 2001, not 2021. March 2001, what was happening? The Al-Aqsa Intifada had broken out in September 2000. It was 6 months in, and the Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam Brigade were doing serious damage to Zionism in defense of the Palestinian people. It has never posed a threat to the British state. It's never posed a threat to British interests. In fact, last year, in April 2024, there was a parliamentary briefing which stated in no uncertain terms about the Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam brigades that it does not have a presence in Britain. It does not target British nationals overseas. It does not target British or Western interests. It says the only presence of Hamas in the United Kingdom is its presence in its political and welfare association, and they carry out charitable projects. So that was in April 2024. It was even more clear back in March 2001. What's critical to understand is why then in November 2021 did the then Home Secretary Priti Patel decide to add the political wing to the ban list? What happened in those intervening years? Hamas won the elections, as Franck mentioned, in 2006. So Hamas won the elections which international observers, including Jimmy Carter, described as free and fair and representative of the democratic voice of the Palestinian people. They were then subjected to a genocidal siege for the next 14 years, and they carried on trying to govern as best they could. Hamas officials were traveling around the world. They were engaging with politicians, including British politicians. In March, or in May 2021, I should say, Israel launched another military incursion into Gaza. They killed 250 people, including 66 children. They injured thousands of Palestinians in that incursion. That triggered a wave of support and solidarity in this country, in something that hadn't been seen before. And the reason was because we're in the age of social media. People were not reliant on the BBC and the mainstream media to provide them details about what was happening. People could see it for themselves on their screens. And in particular, young people were demonstrating, carrying out protests in schools and universities. Young primary school children were having ad hoc protests in their school playgrounds. That triggered the then Education Secretary, a man called Gavin Williamson, to issue a diktat to principals and head teachers, saying that there's a fear of rising anti-Semitism in the United Kingdom, and to counter that, there's a wave of things that schools have to do to deal with the Palestine issue, including a ban on schools dealing with any organization that rejected Israel's right to exist, or so-called right to exist. In fact, Daniel Gruter is one of the other barristers on our team in this case. He and I brought a legal challenge on behalf of Cage International to challenge that policy on the basis that it was unlawful and discriminatory. And that did result in the policy being changed. But the whole conversation suddenly became from terrorism to one of anti-Semitism and protecting Britain's Jewish community, which was ludicrous because large sections of British Jewish community were actually opposing what Israel is doing. 6 months later, there's no further military action. Hamas, or the Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam Brigade, are carrying on sending rockets into Israel as they have been doing. But Priti Patel, all of a sudden, seemingly out of nowhere, came out with an order to ban Hamas in its entirety. And she justified it on the basis of the rockets plus the rise in anti-Semitism, which is not even a basis for banning a group. The only basis for banning a group is they're involved in political violence. Being worried about anti-Semitism sincerely or otherwise is not a basis for doing so. But what you have to understand about Priti Patel, is that she previously was fired from her ministerial role for holding secret meetings with Benjamin Netanyahu and other senior Israeli officials that left her politically compromised. The fact that she was able to rise up the ranks and get an even more senior political position in the British government is an indictment of how influential the Zionist lobby is in this country. And ultimately, when Patel comes into power, one of the things she does is to ban Hamas in its entirety to appease the Zionist lobby. Arguably, this goes against the tradition of the British state to keep a window of dialogue open with the political wing of any armed group, as they did in Ireland with Sinn Féin, and they did with the ANC and other movements around the world. So when you ask me, is it a political decision? Of course it is.
Yeah, and I agree with the framing and the political context. And the only other couple of things I suppose I'd say about this question of political is that, firstly, it's tricky because it seems as though certain liberals, certain judges and lawyers will try to observe this apparent distinction between the legal and the political. And it's quite a tricky distinction. And I often think it's used or it's wielded in bad faith to try to suggest that when a certain kind of legal challenge comes along, that, it will get maligned as political, as though it's supposed to be something other than political. It's supposed to be strictly legal. And so it's important to sit with that tension, I think, instead of pretending it doesn't exist, which is what a lot of liberals will tend to do. And the reality is that we have attempted to hem in the discretion of the Secretary of State. The reality is the Terrorism Act 2000 creates an extremely broad discretion for the Secretary of State to go around designating groups. And as we sort of touched on previously, there's all kinds of groups she could choose to add to that list if she wanted to, right? It's really difficult to overstate just how broad the definition of terrorism in Section 1 of the Terrorism Act 2000 really is. It's even broader than some of the definitions that obtain in the US context, right? The US, for various reasons, has reason to try to define terrorism in certain contexts. But Section 1 of the Terrorism Act is extremely broad. But when you come to challenge any such decision, we do have to confine ourselves to what are called legal arguments. But in reality, the elephant in the room is that a massive part of the context that shapes the way that we attempt to hem in and legally challenge that discretion is unavoidably political. And that's a function of the fact that Tony Blair's administration, in passing the Terrorism Act 2000, deliberately created that level of discretion because it was considered useful to have the power to sort of make basically one side of a conflict illegal. Think about, again, it's really important, I think, to dwell on the Irish origins of this legislation, right? It was pioneered to try and suppress the threat from Irish republicanism, right? Which is to say, the threat that the people in Ireland might not want to be colonised by the British Empire. They might want to rule themselves in the form of a republic, and they might object to the fact that 6 counties of the British Empire's colonial project in Ireland remained after the Irish independence struggle, right? So they're facing this problem, and what they do is, instead of recognising, well, you know what, these people have a degree of popular legitimacy, and in particular, the political wing of the IRA has started to win elections. Instead, what they try to do is to say it's illegal to be a member of this group. It's illegal to talk about this group in certain ways. It's a very clear attempt to suppress their political opponents. And then, as we touched on previously, the Terrorism Act 2000 consolidates that regime, internationalizes it. What could be more political? It's absolutely clear that an apartheid state is engaged in a genocide against a racialized people. The Secretary of State could choose to oppose that. Instead, she's chosen, in accordance with a long-standing British policy of support for Zionism, to support it. And so to put it in a nutshell, it's not possible to understand this case without, as we've said, understanding the political context of the terminal crisis in which Zionism finds itself, but also the broader context of 2 centuries of British imperial support for the racist project of colonizing Palestine.
And with this level of discretion on the decision, what can be achieved under UK law, and what are you hoping to achieve with this case?
That's a common question we get asked, is what are the merits of this succeeding? We'd like to believe that in a fair system, the grounds are so strong that any Home Secretary would look at it, and any reasonable Home Secretary would look at it and grant it and then remove Hamas from the list of banned groups. The reality is we don't have a reasonable Home Secretary. We've got a Zionist Home Secretary, and we've got a series of Zionist Home Secretaries in the past as well. What we're hoping to do is to start at least a conversation, start a discussion. We have to take the action. I mean, there's no point in sitting saying Hamas should be de-proscribed, but not actually taking whatever means there are to effectively get them de-proscribed. So we've done what we were set out to do. We're only having this conversation now because of the application. You can imagine on the 8th of April, before this application was lodged, many journalists, many studios would not be willing to even engage in this discussion because they were fearful that it might break the law somehow. The breadth of the definition of terrorism and the breadth of the powers of the police and other authorities under Section 12 of the Terrorism Act are broad, but they're not that broad. And the problem is they're vague, and people then engage in self-censorship. Now that we have an application lodged with the Home Secretary, and most recently Cage International lodged its own application to de-proscribe Hamas on the behalf of their clients, there's two applications pending. Those who oppose removing Hamas from the list have been engaged in debate and discussion as to why Hamas should stay on the list. And I love it. I think that's really healthy. That's what we want to see in a thriving democracy, is open discussion, fair comment. We're not asking you to accept what Dr. Musa says in his statement, but let's have a discussion about it. So that these discussions are now taking place, I think that's something that is a success in and of itself. And ultimately, when the British public are exposed to these arguments and exposed to another side of the story, it will allow an environment to be created in which it becomes easier for a Home Secretary, either this one or a more courageous one who may follow her, to make the right decision. At the moment, the Home Secretary feels that it is extremely difficult. I do sincerely empathize with her, with the amount of pressure she was probably under from the Zionist lobby to keep Hamas on this list and the implications for her career. But as we say, that Yvette Cooper, it takes courage. It took courage for politicians in the past to sit with Sinn Féin. It took courage for politicians to sit with Nelson Mandela. But ultimately, those two decisions were instrumental to peace being in Ireland at the moment and in South Africa today. So what we would like this discussion to lead to is to those negotiations, because Hamas is not going away. It's going to be there tomorrow in one form or another. It is representative of a significant portion of the Palestinian people. It is the last elected government in Palestine. It is mandatory on anybody seeking to see an end to the mindless slaughter of innocent lives, the genocide that we are seeing live streamed on our screens. Anybody who wants to see an end to that really should be taking difficult steps at this point. Tony Blair, at the time, was central to the political boycott of Hamas after it won the elections. Many years later, in his retirement, he is now expressing regret, seeing it as a missed opportunity that they were not engaged. And we say to Yvette Cooper that it's no point having regrets later in your life. Now's the time for courage. Now's the time for effective action.
Absolutely. And I think life comes at you fast, and it can seem as though an extremely violent conflict like the Palestinian liberation struggle against the apartheid state of Israel, it can seem as though that's just going to be with us forever or something, right? Like, how could we possibly resolve such a bloody, violent, genocidal conflict? But, you know, someone who comes from the north of Ireland, but also someone who studied the history of South Africa, things can seem extremely intractable, but then the will of the colonizer, the will of the people administering an apartheid regime or, you know, a system of segregation, at some point something snaps and it collapses. And then people who, Nelson Mandela is a really helpful figure in this regard, I think. You know, the British government supported the apartheid state of South Africa in seeking Mandela's execution. And he's now regarded as one of the most heroic people of his generation. I don't think that's any overstatement, right? Everyone thinks that man, what he sacrificed, what he did, and then emerging from decades spent in prison on Robben Island, having faced a trial at which he could have been executed by the South African state, right? He escaped execution by the skin of his teeth and looked into the judge's eye and gave that famous speech at the Rivonia trial, right? He talked about wanting to live to see free and fair South Africa in which black people and white people were treated equally, but it was an idea for which he was, he wanted to live to see it realised, but he was prepared to die for that ideal. And he did live to see it realised, right? It's stunning, and it's the most human of stories, right? The way that dignity and people's resolve can triumph over apartheid and colonialism, and the same in the north of Ireland. I remember when I was younger, when I was still a child, seeing Martin Magennis, who sat on the Army Council of the IRA, the Provisional IRA, transform himself into a man of peace and a politician. We see something similar with Gerry Adams, right? Shaking hands with people like Ian Paisley. My father never would have thought that he would live to see that, right? My father, who grew up in South Armagh, he never thought that he would see the Reverend Ian Paisley shaking hands with a member of the IRA, and yet it happened, and we have peace in the north of Ireland now. And so life does come at you fast. It does seem as though Israel's collapsing. As we talk, and I'm not here to predict the future, but as we talk, there are airstrikes raining down on Tel Aviv and Haifa. The situation is extremely volatile. No one can say what's going to happen. And what's called for now is for, as Fahad said, what's necessary is for politicians to have courage and to stand up and say, well, I may not support everything they do. I'm certainly not going to express support for the organization because that would be a crime. But I do support this application. And I think perhaps the most obvious example of this is people like Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, as Fahad said, meeting with Sinn Féin at the height of the Troubles, when doing so was considered almost treasonous. They had, those backbench MPs had the courage to go and meet with the political wing of an armed organisation like the Irish Republican Army. And here we are decades later with the Good Friday Agreement and whatever people think of it. And some people are critical of the precise terms of that agreement, but broadly it's undeniable that people are not blowing each other up anymore in the north of Ireland. Catholics aren't being driven out of their homes by loyalist-backed, state-backed loyalist mobs. Like, the situation is much more peaceful. So it is to be hoped that we can achieve peace in Palestine, and that's what this application more than anything is about, and that's what Hamas are about. I know a lot of people in Britain and the West will struggle to hear that and will struggle to imagine that Hamas are serious about peace. But that's what they're calling for. They want a peaceful solution. They want a long-term truce with a view to creating a pluralistic democracy in which people from different political traditions can participate in a democracy of all its citizens. That's what a single democratic Palestinian state actually means. It means peace. There won't be peace for as long as the explicitly racist ideology of Zionism and the colonial project of the so-called State of Israel is allowed to continue in its present form. It needs to be fundamentally revisited. And this application is one, in some ways, small piece of that overall picture. Like, what does a peaceful resolution of the Palestinian conflict look like? The application makes the claim that if you want peace, you have to talk to people you disagree with, and you certainly have to talk to people who win elections, because if you don't, you end up with the alternative logic, which is the logic of this genocide, perhaps most clearly expressed by President Isaac Herzog, as he was quoted by the ICJ itself in January of last year in that genocide case, the genocide judgment, where he is quoted as saying, and I paraphrase, it's not true, this rhetoric about innocent civilians. They could have risen up and overthrown that evil regime. He's explicitly endorsing the alternative to this application, which is that if you voted for Hamas, you're not innocent, you're not a civilian, and you can be murdered en masse because you're not Jewish and you're therefore a racial threat to the purity of the so-called Jewish state, the apartheid state of Israel.
And how does this message and the opening of discussion that is facilitated with this case or that the case contributes to, how is it received and how does it resonate within the larger anti-Zionist and pro-Palestine movement?
I believe it's been warmly received. It's almost like people have been waiting for this opportunity, this moment. For example, Jewish Voices for Labour, a Jewish anti-Zionist group, they uploaded the entire application onto their website, as well as some of the expert reports. And they did that in response to senior ministers or opposition ministers in this country describing the application itself as sickening without ever having even read it. And they said it's not sickening, it's a needed discussion, and it raises a lot of interest for public interest points. we've received a lot of support from around the world, including from Gaza, from Palestine. And more than anything else, I think that for me means that it's the right thing we're doing. There's always going to be people who are going to sit on the fence. There's going to be people who will silently support it. And then there'll be our critics. And that comes with the territory. It's absolutely normal to have that. But amongst people who want to see an end to the genocide, an end to the killing, my feeling is that they welcome this. They do not, many of them have expressly said so, they do not agree with Hamas, they do not support them in any way, they don't agree with everything they do, but they understand the need for dialogue and the need to lift this proscription and for Palestinians to be allowed to defend themselves. We are coming up to the 30th anniversary of the Srebrenica massacre, the genocide in Srebrenica. And at the time, one of the calls and the slogans in public was to arm Bosnia, because the idea being that Bosnians should be allowed to defend themselves, whereas one side already had a massive arsenal of weapons and was being military backed by numerous states. The Bosnians were essentially left to die. And whether you agree or disagree with their position or their politics, surely in any situation, both sides should be at least armed to defend themselves, to be an equality of arms between them. And this proscription, I think people see it for that. Hold on a second. Whatever happened 20 months ago, the Palestinians are being exterminated. I mean, and I don't use that word like sparingly. They're being exterminated. They are being subjected to a Holocaust. And one of the primary groups that is there and has the ability to defend them against that and is doing so, they are banned, meaning
Absolutely.
You can't even say anything about them.
Absolutely. I think that the fact of the matter, it's always difficult to talk about counterfactuals, but it seems clear that if Hamas did not exist, Israel would have succeeded in its genocidal intentions. Like, Hamas are the main thing standing between the apartheid state of Israel and the people of Palestine. That's the reality. And I'm reminded, or I would draw people's attention to the concluding paragraph of the drafting, right? The pleadings in this case. We talk about how the ideology of Zionism is and always has been a staggering affront to Palestinian dignity. And then we say that if Hamas did not exist, the Palestinians would invent it. Call it what you want. Even if Israel tries to claim that they've won some Carthaginian victory, they've wiped out their enemies and they've destroyed Hamas at whatever horrific cost to the Palestinians, however many tens or hundreds of thousands of Palestinians had to be murdered to achieve that goal. Say in some grim future that the Zionist state of Israel somehow achieves that, a new form of armed struggle to resist Zionism will inevitably emerge. You cannot tell people that they're subhuman, that the fact that they're not Jewish, that they're somehow the wrong race, is some kind of problem to be solved with various forms of demographic engineering, more or less violent, and expect some of them not to create sophisticated groups that will prefer death to living in that kind of indignity. That's the reality of what it means to be human, is that we need dignity. We can't live without it. And that's why we founded our arguments about human rights, by reminding the British state about what its own courts and what the European Convention on Human Rights and all the rest of it, the entire premise, the very foundation of human rights law, is about concern for humans and their needs. And more than anything else, humans will die rather than live without dignity. And that is the rock, the rock on which Zionism will dash itself, is the rock of Palestinian humanity and Palestinian dignity.
I would like to speak a bit more about the post and your vision of de-zionized Palestine could be. But before that, you mentioned a bit before the fact that the context, the political context, and the perception is changing somehow. When you were talking about how the political context influences legal decisions. Are you seeing an influence now in your work? Are you seeing more cases, for example, related to Palestine? Do you see that there is some kind of momentum for anti-Zionism in legal courts?
I mean, I'll let Frank start because he's probably got more experience on this at the moment.
Oh, I don't know. It's a healthy sort of a competition to have, isn't it, Fahad? But I would say that most of my practice now revolves around criticizing Zionism in one form or another. And I don't want to be too critical, but I think some of my colleagues at the bar haven't quite understood the gravity of the crisis in which Zionism finds itself. And it's been my experience that it's extremely easy now to go into any kind of British court or tribunal and just state some very obvious facts about Zionism, state some obvious recent authorities from various, from various courts and tribunals and the rest of it, right? The ICJ, the ICC. It's in terminal crisis. That's not my opinion. I might have my own personal opinion about what's happening, but the ICC issued arrest warrants against the Prime Minister and the former Defence Minister. So if the current Prime Minister of Israel comes to the territory of his closest allies, he'll be arrested. The ICJ is considering whether or not it's genocide, and if they do, then it will just be an indelible stain on the record of the apartheid state of Israel. It's, as I've said, it's already been confirmed that it's apartheid. There's no coming back from that, is there? It's an apartheid state. It's engaged in racial domination. And that allows us to just go into court and say all of the stuff that I've just said to you. It's like, well, hold on, it's apartheid, which means it's racial domination. And, our sort of Zionists are fond of relying quite heavily on the IHRA definition. In my opinion, that definition is just completely broken, and I don't think anyone can really defend it anymore. And if you go into court and make some principal arguments against it, and certainly its most egregious examples, the examples that talk about the so-called state of Israel, they just fall apart under scrutiny, right? This stuff about, you can't say that Israel's a racist endeavor, and if you do, you hate Jews. That's just stupid. And if you go and say that to a judge, like, what? Is genocide a racist endeavor, my lord? Then the High Court judge will say, yeah, that must be right. That it must be irrational to suggest that that's anti-Semitic. And so we had a recent judgment of the High Court about a month ago that confirms you're allowed to call for Israel to be abolished. You're allowed to think it shouldn't exist. That's not anti-Semitic. You're allowed to suggest it's a racist endeavor. That's not anti-Semitic without more. And it even goes as far as to say that it must be right because Israel is governed by fascists, right? So again, you can go into a court and just say, the finance minister is a fascist. How do we know that? Because Bezalel Smotrich told us that he's a fascist. Like a lot of lawyers in England, because there's all of this sort of this low hum of colonial thinking and common sense understanding that Zionism is somehow good and respectable, English judges aren't often used to hearing these arguments. But Zionism finds itself in such a profound crisis that you can now just go into these rarefied environments that we call courtrooms and just say, look, I'm very sorry to have to be the bearer of bad news, but this is extremely racist. It's colonial. It's racial domination. It's an illegal occupation that's lasted for more than half a century. It's engaged in genocide. And when you do that, in my experience, the arguments of the Zionist opposition tend to fall apart. I think there's a particularly important argument that's playing itself out at the moment that, again, I would invite my colleagues at the bar to be a bit more courageous and robust about making. And stop me if I get into the weeds too much. But basically, there's a very fast evolving area of case law that talks about philosophical belief. And there's a very important judgment that my friend Zach Zamor, a Palestinian barrister, argued successfully. He showed in the case of David Miller that anti-Zionist beliefs can be worthy of protection under the Equality Act, which means that people can be discriminated against because they have expressed or manifested their anti-Zionist beliefs. Now, in my opinion, the cold face of that argument in English courts is to argue the reverse proposition, right? So that case successfully showed that anti-Zionist beliefs are worthy of protection in a democratic society. That's one of the 5 limbs of the test that determines when a belief will and won't be worthy of protection. In my opinion, it is now very easy to go into an English court and where any Zionist beliefs are in play, whether it's the beliefs of an expert witness that the other side may have called, right, a Zionist expert, or if it's the beliefs of one of the witnesses, or if Zionism comes into play in any respect at all, right, you might be criticizing a government policy. It's very easy to just go in and say that set of beliefs is not worthy of protection in a democratic society. And there are lots of ways of showing that, but the most obvious one is simply to say, well, my lord, or sir, or whoever you're addressing, it's a matter of settled international law that Israel's an apartheid state. It's also undeniable that Zionism is its official ideology. It would seem to follow logically that Zionism is an apartheid ideology, and it must be true that apartheid is a staggering affront to democracy. It's obviously not democratic to treat one racial group like it's superior to another and to allow them to be racially dominated. So we're at the point now, in my opinion, where it's only a matter of time before a courageous judge says, yes, that must be right. Zionism is not worthy of protection in a democratic society because it's an apartheid ideology that stands accused of massacring Palestinians in a genocide because they're deemed to be the wrong race. So it feels like it's over for Zionism, in my opinion. And I think a lot of people haven't got the memo, and I'm not inviting people to be complacent. But I really think, just based on conversations I've had with colleagues at the bar and conversations I've had in court, so to speak, submissions I've made in court, I don't think Zionism is capable of defending itself anymore. I think that we're in Emperor's New Clothes territory, and all it takes is some little kid to say, hold on, this is naked racism.
Thank you. I like this take. It's nice to hear voices that would actually provide arguments that Zionism is potentially reaching an end, or at least can be officially rejected. What do you think should come next?
In the day after scenario, we're in this strange parallel universe where the entire world on the Western Hemisphere is talking about the day after Israel completes its genocide and Hamas is gone and what's going to replace it. And in our conversations, it's the day after is the opposite. It's when Israel is finished and Zionism is finished, what's going to replace it? And I think that's where this needs to be some synergy between what we're doing in court and indeed outside the court and the One Democratic State initiative. Because that is the only really lasting way that there can be peace. I mean, the two-state solution is dead and buried. There is a desperate attempt to try to resuscitate it amidst the rubble in Gaza, but it's not going to happen. You can see how there is huge efforts being made to rescue the Zionist project, rescue the colonial project, by pinning everything on Netanyahu and this particular government, rather than addressing the fact that this has been happening for 77 years. This was just an intensification of a genocide that began 77 years ago. And what we must not allow to happen, and we can be complacent, is to allow those people to try to come in and intervene at this point and push Netanyahu under the bus, so to speak, and rescue Zionism. There are, unfortunately, many people who are, well-wishing and well-intentioned, but they don't understand the difference or the lack of a difference between the substantial difference between a liberal Zionist and a right-wing Zionist. Ultimately, they all believe in settler colonialism. They believe in theft of Palestinian land. And they believe in this artificial two-state solution whereby Israel continues to steal and settle land with European immigrants while Palestinians continue to lose their land and continue to live in concentration camps. That has gone on for the best part of a quarter of a century now, and it cannot be allowed to continue in this manner. A point comes where you look at this and you think, this was never intended to succeed. This was always intended to suppress Palestinian dignity, to suppress Palestinian liberation, and to strengthen Zionism and the State of Israel. The State of Israel is an abomination. It is currently, or it has done so in the past 20 months, violated the sovereignty of 5 of its neighbouring countries. It's currently engaged in, again, starting a conflict with Iran. To its regret, it has realised that Iran has some sort of power and some sort of armoury with which it can defend itself. But if Israel is allowed to continue on the path it's going, we will be entering a third world war. I have no doubt about it. And it would be unfortunate if that's what it takes to de-zionise Israel. But it may well be the only thing that wakes the world up to this reality. I hate to be so morbid about it, but it is essentially where we are going. The British public, the world public, has the opportunity to stop that from happening and intervene now and tell everybody we do not believe in a two-state solution. There can only be one democratic state for all the citizens of Palestine. Let the refugees return to their homes. If they choose to, give them compensation. But the priority should be they should be allowed to come back to the homes that they rightfully that they rightfully own?
Yeah, I think this is a very important question. I think it's very complicated and tricky. I mean, in some ways it's very simple, but in other ways it's very complicated. Like so many things, you can look at it one way or another. I mean, the simple answer is some kind of one democratic state is what the solution looks like, I think. I don't see how, as Fahad said, the two-state solution can be resurrected. And in any event, it was a racist solution to a racist problem, right? The problem was, how do we maintain, how do Zionists maintain a racially pure Jewish state? Like, that's a doomed project. And even if you have two states, a Palestinian state and a Jewish state, that Jewish state is still going to be an apartheid state. It's still going to view non-Jews as a problem, and it's still going to engage in all kinds of disgusting demographic engineering to make sure that Jews remain a majority. And it's not that dissimilar to what happened in the north of Ireland, right? This kind of obsessive Ulster Unionist position, like this obsession with Catholic birth rates and what are we going to do about the Catholic population getting too big. And that's the reality of what happens if you define your nation in explicitly racial or ethnic terms, right? So the solution has to be one in which Zionism is abolished. This idea that you can have a Jewish state is racist. It's direct race discrimination. And there's the kind of obvious stuff. I think that we do need to think in terms of trying to sketch a picture of what peace looks like and what a single democratic state looks like. And the problem with trying to paint that picture is that the Zionist strategy it consists in deliberately fragmenting the Palestinian people. The 2017 UN ESCO report, right? Richard Falk and Virginia Tilley talk persuasively about this, and many people have talked about this, right? Many Palestinians have talked about the deliberate policy of fragmenting the Palestinian nation so that it cannot emerge, and fragmenting it into these different domains, right? Gaza, West Bank, East Jerusalem, 48, diaspora, right? So if those 5 domains can be allowed to reconvene, to reconstitute themselves as a nation, right? If the refugees are allowed to return, and if those 4 domains in the territory of Palestine are allowed to exist under a single democratic state, then it's clear that Zionism's over. It's lost the obnoxious demographic colonial war that it's been fighting for the better part of a century. And so that's part of the picture, is how do you defragment the deliberate fragmentation of the Palestinian people? Another part of the picture is what happens to Jewish Israelis under a democratic state. And I think I have to criticize some calls for some kind of reverse Zionism, where you say, Jews are somehow, like their right to be Palestinians is somehow called into question. I think that's dubious. I think you have to throw this identity politics on steroids, as you might call Zionism, out the window, and just say, no, actually, as a famous Black Panther, I think it was Huey Newton or possibly Kwame Ture, said famously about, we don't fight fire with fire, you fight it with water, right? You don't fight Zionism with some kind of reverse ethno-supremacy. You fight Zionism with democracy, and you just say, it doesn't matter whether you're Jewish, Christian, Muslim, whoever you are, let's come up with a thoughtful conception of what it means to be Palestinian. Now, it's clear that when South African apartheid collapsed, something like, I think, 800,000 white South Africans left. And it's clear, it's almost certain that something similar will happen in Palestine if it's not happening already. It seems like the Zionist entity tries to keep very quiet the statistics about the number of Jewish Israelis fleeing Palestine, but it seems clear that a lot of them are, right? It's difficult to parse this properly because the situation is moving so fast. But after those Iranian airstrikes started landing on Haifa and Tel Aviv in earnest, it's my understanding that Jewish Israelis with dual nationality have been fleeing en masse, and that phenomenon is likely to continue. But what I would say is that there's a really difficult question. Like, again, life comes at you fast, and I'm just some guy. I'm just one person. Like, what do I know? But it seems to me like we have to have a difficult conversation about how do you go from a one-state reality, which is an apartheid reality, to a one-state solution, which is a democratic solution. And concretely, it seems to me that that's going to require drawing up constituencies. You're going to have to draw up constituencies in the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and say these are currently governed by an occupying state. What's called for is a kind of one man, one vote type situation where Palestinians are allowed to say, go on then, just give us a vote. And then what will happen effectively, what will have happened, is that the from the river to the sea Zionists, so to speak, the fascist end of Zionism that says we need to keep colonizing, they will have bitten off more Palestinians than they can chew, and all it will take is for Palestinians to say, go on then, you say you're a democracy, well, you've been occupying us for more than half a century, can I have a vote please? And if that happens, Zionism's over. And that's very difficult to imagine. And I do think the situation in Ireland is similar in some ways, right? You look at South Africa, you look at Algeria, you look at Lebanon, there are some analogies there, but in some ways this two-state phenomenon maps most clearly onto the Irish situation, because there are two states in Ireland currently. And I mean, perhaps this is an overly playful side note, but we're forever being criticised. Like, oh, you're so obsessed with Israel or whatever. Are there any other states that you want to abolish? And it's like, I come from the north of Ireland. Like, I want the north of Ireland to be abolished. I think there should be a single state of Ireland, and I think there should be a single state of Palestine, because I think that colonialism is bad and should be replaced with something like less violent and less racist. So, I mean, very, very difficult to imagine what a single democratic Palestinian state looks like, but that is precisely the difficult imaginative task that we have to engage in, and that requires us to have difficult conversations, like the sort of conversations that are happening with Protestants in the north of Ireland, you know, and it's very hopeful to see how some Protestants in the north of Ireland are learning how to speak Irish, for example. Like, there's a whole generation that's grown up in a much more peaceful context that are allowed to start going, oh, do you know what? In my father's generation, your cultural symbols, the aspects of your Irishness that were most obvious were somehow threatening to me or my father's generation. But you've got young Protestants learning Irish now and thinking about what it would mean with the EU. Like, what would it mean for us to join a united Ireland that rejoined the EU? I'm not making a direct analogy, but I do think we learn something from studying these other examples. And I do think the Irish example is quite a hopeful one.
Thank you. I really like everything that you shared. I like that you're going into this discussion about saying more than one state. What do we want as this one state? This is one of the discussions that we are having at the initiative of, like, saying one democratic state. It's not just saying we refuse two states. It's going beyond this and thinking, okay, what are the principles of one democratic Palestinian state? And one of these principles is the depoliticization of identity. So what you are sharing about this question of going beyond an identity against another one, I find like it really resonates with what we are saying. And I also really like that you're looking at other examples, and at the example of Northern Ireland that obviously you know very well. How do you think that, or obviously there are a lot of different examples that are similar in this regard, but how are they actually connected? Are there links between what we see, what Zionism is doing, what the UK empire is doing? How is all of this connected according to you?
Well, it's the same empire, isn't it? The British colonized Palestine and they colonized Ireland. They colonized half the world. They colonized India. So, I mean, in some ways, a lot of the most obvious examples are ones that come to us from studying the British Empire. I think the way that India was violently divided up is horrible, and the scars are still being felt today, right? And then, of course, the way that Pakistan broke into its separate wings. Like, as usual, the British had this policy of playing divide and rule. And I think it's really important to study that. It's a very well-worn imperial tactic to stoke an ethnic division and then to benefit from the resulting division, and that allows you to engage in this kind of colonial extractivist governance. So we definitely learned from studying the British Empire and their obnoxious, deliberately, consciously racist policies of trying to turn people against each other. And I don't want to center Jews at this moment because that's such a dubious thing. That's Zionism, right? Zionism says that the Holocaust was obviously horrific. We should center that for all time, even though it ended 80 years ago, and use that to justify overwriting and ignoring and justifying the Holocaust of Palestinians that's happening as you and I are speaking. But I do think that we have to have a conversation about, as you say, what does it mean to move beyond identity, and then to specifically look at the way that the British to begin with, and then for a while the French, and now the US empire have deliberately wielded Jewish trauma in the Holocaust in order to create this absurd fantasy of a Jewish colony. Like the fact that this little loyal Jewish Ulster has been somehow breathed into existence, it's not separable from the Holocaust. You can't really understand it without the Holocaust. Obviously, there was precursor violence, especially in Russia and the pogroms in Russia. That is part of the picture here. But I do think, and it's only one component, and again, we must center Palestinians because they're the ones who are being genocided. But I do think that doing that work of recognizing that this disgusting, cynical way the trauma of the Holocaust has been used to create this extremely anti-Semitic experiment, right? Think about Israel as an unsinkable aircraft carrier that advances primarily US and NATO military geostrategic interests in the region. And it's staffed almost exclusively by Jews. Its army is formed almost exclusively of Jews and so-called Israeli citizens. Palestinians are exempt, and most Jewish Israeli citizens have to serve for between 3 and 2 years, depending on whether they're men or women. Like, that's asking, every Jew, as the law of return has it, the so-called law of return 1950 says, every Jew may return to Israel and then be forced to serve in the army, go and do a genocide, and go and die for the interests of the non-Jewish US empire. It's extremely anti-Semitic, and it's not properly conceived of in those terms. And I think if we're to dismantle Zionism, part of that picture has to be going to Jewish comrades, Jewish friends, and Jewish opponents and saying, let's have a serious conversation about trauma. And instead of this endless cycle of, look, the Nazis treated Jews like they were fundamentally incompatible with the German nation and tried to solve that so-called problem with the genocide of Jews. And then Zionism comes along, and it's almost like it inherits that logic from Nazism and says, we're going to create a Jewish ethno-state that views Palestinians as a problem, and it's now solving that so-called problem with more mass murder and genocide. And it's almost as though this burden falls on the Palestinians to say, you've just done a genocide against us. You've just engaged in the mass murder of us because we weren't Jewish, and because of that fact, you viewed us as a threat to your ethno-state. That project must not be allowed to survive. Can we just step away from the idea that genocide might be a solution to our problems? And can we heal together from this violence, the violence of the Holocaust, but the more urgent and immediate violence of this Palestinian Holocaust? And can we think about what it means to create a society in which the generations of healing can take place? Because it's going to take generations for the Palestinians to heal from this. And the one thing I suppose I can end this part of my answer on is to talk about the re-emergence of the figure. And again, I'm not trying to center it, but I do think as part of this imaginative exercise, imagining what a single democratic state of Palestine looks like, we need to imagine, among other things, the re-emergence of the figure of the Jewish Palestinian, because it's Zionism that says you cannot be Jewish and Palestinian at the same time. And there were Jews in Palestine, there were Palestinian Jews before Zionism came along, and we need to think carefully and gently about what it means for such a figure to re-emerge, because really the peaceful re-emergence of the figure of the Palestinian Jew is part of the picture that obliterates this obnoxious racist ideology that we call Zionism and its colonial project called the so-called State of Israel.
Coming back to the legal aspects and to your work, how do you think, or how helpful can the framework of one democratic state be in such legal cases?
As I said, I think there needs to be synergy. There needs to be a lot more discussions happening between people who subscribe to this type of thinking and this type of solution. That doesn't seem to be happening at the moment, for better or for worse. And it seems that a lot of us are on the same wavelength, but we're sort of disparate, and we need to sort of bring together our thinking, have more sort of conferences, seminars. Something Franck and I are looking to do is to go out and train other lawyers in how to argue these cases. Doing that in conjunction with groups like ODSI and others, I think is going to be very beneficial. The more I've sort of explored this in the last few months in particular, the more I've realized how many people actually support the concept of one democratic state. And everyone seems to be working in silos, and that has to stop. I think people have to come together, have more conversations, and I think now, if ever there was a time to push this, it's now. So once we sort of have those discussions, we have those meetings, we can develop a framework, we can develop strategies to, for example, I'm not sure, ODSI, do you intervene in legal cases? Do you contribute expertise in the form of expert witnesses in court cases? That's something definitely that should be happening. There's enough people who are giving bogus testimonies to justify a genocidal solution, whereas people who are on the side of truth and justice are for some reason reluctant to enter the arena in a legal sense. So a lot of people are writing academic reports, writing research, but there's no connection between that and the legal strategies and the legal cases that Franck and I, for example, are running. So that has to merge, I think, to bring things together.
Yeah, absolutely. And just echoing what you said, Fahad, about training, I think that it is partly about training and arming people with the requisite arguments, the legal arguments, as well as the facts. And I think that's why having 20 experts is so powerful, right? Among them, Avi Shleim, right? Formidable anti-Zionist Jewish historian. So partly it's about giving people the sorts of materials they need and seeing, oh, this is how they did it in this application, and sharing those materials and like Fahad says, creating these spaces, these conferences, these pedagogical environments where we enter into this sort of dialogue about, you know, what's the problem? What are the problems that we're encountering in court and how do we go about solving them together? But I also think, to be blunt, part of the problem is a lack of courage and a lack of samud, as the Palestinians would say, right? Some lawyers in this country are not steadfast enough. They're not courageous enough. And that's not me morally judging them. In my opinion, courage is something that we cultivate collectively, as is solidarity, right? Solidarity is a sense of trust that emerges out of a shared experience of struggle, right? I trust Fahad. I have an extremely profound sense of solidarity with Fahad because he and I have been through so many struggles together. It's like, you know what someone's like under fire because you've been in the trenches with them. So solidarity emerges and courage emerges. When you see someone else being courageous, it's infectious. It encourages you to be like, oh, do you know what? It is a genocide. I will go in and say the difficult argument, and maybe the judge is going to wince a bit. You know, maybe the judge is going to push back against what I'm trying to say, but I will just go in and say it and say, well, do you know what? The ICJ last year said it's apartheid. Can we just at least acknowledge that? I think creating space for us to just say, like, look, it's okay to be scared. It's okay to think that the British Empire is going to be angry at you if you go into one of its courts and say, hold on a second, didn't you do this? Isn't this all your fault? Like, you can do that. It's just, you need a bit of courage. You need to know what you're talking about. And you probably need some comrades and some people you trust in your corner to back you up if there's a backlash. And I think we can cultivate those things together. And it makes me feel very hopeful. And certainly working with Fahad has always made me feel very hopeful because it's just a relief to know that I'm not the only person who thinks that lawyers should go into court and say the quiet part loud and say obvious stuff about the obviously racist project of Zionism.
I believe part of the problem is that affects lawyers' ability to show courage in these times is the very powerful work of the small but loud Zionist lobby in this country, who will do everything from smearing you online to reporting you to your regulator to even reporting you to counterterrorism police. They may even label you an anti-Semite in court and then put a report about you to your regulator afterwards. But these are the type of challenges that people will face. But ultimately, it goes down to a question of principle and a question of where do your principles lie? You went into this did you come into law? And a lot of the lawyers I think that Franck is referring to are not the corporate commercial type. They are barristers who describe themselves as human rights specialists, human rights barristers, who work in human rights chambers, who talk about fearing none and doing good. These are the type of people we're talking about. It's not the corporate banking lawyers, it's the human rights lawyers. So if you've gone in to make a career for yourself in human rights, and I use that word deliberately, a career, because that's what it's become. It's become an industry. You came in to try to make the world a better place. You got pressured by the lobby, and you decided to leave the genocide in place instead. So people have to make a decision. Look, am I actually true to myself? Am I actually true to my principles? Of course, they are going to strike back. The Palestinians did not resist Israel because they didn't realize that there's going to be a backlash. Of course, they knew there'd be a backlash, but they were more willing to risk that and to live, on their feet than die on their knees, to use the stereotypical adage. But that's the reality. We have to come to that position that when you stand against tyranny, when you stand for the truth and you speak truth to power, there will be a backlash against you. It would be ludicrous to think otherwise. All of the great heroes we have in the past and our contemporary heroes that we look up to and we admire, people who went through prison, who were assassinated, who endured extreme hardship because they took a stance for truth, for justice. We admire them. Why? Because of that stance, because of the hardships they endured. We're going to go through that, but at the end of the day, none of us are going to suffer in the way the Palestinians are suffering. None of us are going to see our children incinerated before our eyes or torn into various body parts where you're looking with a shopping bag trying to piece it together. None of us have to face that. I often, when I'm feeling under pressure, I do look at what's happening in Gaza and I see the resilience of those people. I see that doctor who lost 9 children in one attack. Why? Because she was a doctor. Because of the deliberate practice of targeting healthcare workers and their families. And yet the incredible thing is not just the patience and the samud she shows on receiving that news and her husband and her 10th child being brought into hospital, but the fact that she knows this has happened because of her choice to be a doctor on the front line in this struggle against apartheid, in the struggle against genocide. The very next day, she turns back up at work. And that's her resilience. That's her samud. And then we get concerned about being reported to our regulator for alleged anti-Semitism because we stood up against tyranny. When you see what they're going through, then it sort of gives you that sense that whatever we're suffering, they're like minor inconveniences. And that's the way we need to look at these things. That if the state is not attacking you, then perhaps you're not resisting enough. Perhaps you're the problem. At a particularly difficult time since we launched this case, we've had our own challenges, all of us. And at a particularly difficult time, I received a message from one of the parents of the Palestine actionists, the Filton 18, who are currently in prison for having the audacity to allegedly smash up an Israeli arms factory in this country. So these are the factories, the Elbit system factories, which are manufacturing drones, which would be quadcopter drones would be sent to Gaza to draw out Palestinians and execute them. So these courageous young people decided to take it upon themselves to take whatever steps they could to prevent acts of genocide when they saw that their state had failed to do so. For their troubles, they're in prison. Some of them for 18 months at this stage, without trial. Now, at this stage, I received a message from the parent as a letter from his daughter. And she said, if you do not feel the boot of the oppressor weighing down upon your neck, then you are complicit. So if you don't feel the weight of the oppressor's boot on your neck at this moment in time, then you are complicit. And for me, that was a validation of what we're doing. That whatever else is coming our way, we can deal with it because we have to deal with it. And if we don't deal with it, then we may as well just go and do something else for a living.
It's actually a good transition to my next question, which is, what would be your message today for people in the UK?
Well, I prefer Britain, but to people in Britain, I would say that Zionism is collapsing. It's in terminal crisis, in my opinion. It's bleeding to death. That doesn't mean that you should be complacent. Wounded beast, a dying beast is sometimes at its most dangerous. But we must not rest until Zionism is completely defeated and the apartheid state of Israel is completely dismantled. And if you feel scared, that's okay. Courage is what you do when you face your fear. That's what courage means. It means to face your fear. It's okay to be afraid and to talk to other people about that fear. A problem shared is a problem halved. Find a way to resist the racist ideology of Zionism and collectivize your struggle. Talk to your family, talk to your trade union, talk to your colleagues. Find ways to stand up and be counted. And I would also encourage people to start thinking about what a single democratic state of Palestine looks like, to have those kind of courageous conversations. Okay, what does the one state Palestinian solution look like? Like, start to think that through together so that we can imagine it together. And then specifically to lawyers, Fahad and I were both maybe a bit critical of some of our colleagues. I think that criticism was constructive. Like, I always try, and I know Fahad does, like, to come from a place of love and humility. Like, I'm not here to tell anyone what to do, and I'm not here to judge anyone. Okay, I'm not God. It's not my place to judge anyone. All right, We can have disagreements about what it means to resist a genocide. Some people prefer a quieter strategy behind the scenes, whatever, all right? I'm not here to judge anyone. I am here to criticize people. I think that people in my profession need to do better. They need to dedicate more of their time to the urgent question of their own government's complicity and participation in a genocide. And they need to find more courageous ways of going into court and simply naming the problem for what it is. The problem is Zionism. The problem is the British, the French, NATO and US support for the project of Zionism. And the solution is a democratic state called Palestine, which will be free and fair and will treat all of its citizens equally, regardless of whether they are Palestinian, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, whatever. Zionism is the problem. Palestine is the solution.
Yeah, I guess my message to the British public is similar. The Zionism is collapsing. It will be consigned to the dustbin of history the way Rhodesia was. And if even at this stage, with everything you've witnessed for the past 20 months, that you are still flying that flag, that Israeli flag in your bio, on your social media feed, and you're standing with Israel and supporting Israel's so-called right to self-defense, even after you've seen what you've seen, then know that you are going to be consigned to the dustbin of history as well. That you deserve whatever opprobrium that you will face, not just from the members of the public, but from your own grandchildren. They are going to basically be ashamed because they're going to carry the stain of what you have endorsed and enabled for the past 20 months, if not longer. And there are people who are scrambling to get on the right side of history. And if they're sincere and they've woken up to the evil of Zionism, then of course, we welcome everybody. Everybody's allowed to change their mind. But at the same time, we will never forget the role they played in enabling this genocide. They cannot escape accountability because they've had finally a change of heart, because they've seen the direction the wind is traveling in now, and it's not the one that they like. So, and for those people who have been on the front lines, the people who are sacrificing everything, and I mean everything, from their freedom, their status, their platforms, their careers, their jobs, their university places. People have made huge sacrifices. And I say, we see you. And maybe the world doesn't, but we see you. The Palestinians see you. We salute that courage, that bravery, those principles that are so lacking amongst many other people. And ultimately, they will be the ones who are on the right side of history. They'll be the ones who will be able to look their grandkids in the eye, and when they ask them, Mom, Dad, Granddad, Grandma, you were alive during the genocide, what did you do? What did you do? And that's a question every single one of us has to ask ourselves, that what did we do? Because people will ask us.
Yeah. We always end these interviews with asking participants what is their message to Israelis and Palestinians. So I would like you to also try this exercise, starting maybe with your message to Israelis.
I guess my message to the Israelis is, again, just wake up to the reality. You may have been born in Israel and you may have no part to play in what's happened, but you can't blindly exist in that society and not see what's going on. We're not living in a closed society. We're living in a global society with the age of social media. You don't have an excuse to say you're unaware of what your country was doing in your name. It's up to you. I mean, Israelis are having protests to get their hostages back, which is very understanding. And they're protesting against the war not because it's wrong, not because it's genocidal in nature, but because it risks the safety of their countrymen, those hostages. That's really messed up. I mean, if you're principled enough, Israelis should be en masse going and trying to get into Gaza, making human chains to go in. And sadly, that's not what's happening. And the statistics show that the majority of Israelis are supportive of what's happening in Gaza, supportive of the apartheid regime, because they benefit from it. So my message to them is that they too need to wake up. No one's asking for them to be ethnically cleansed from the land. You are not the insecure minority struggling to survive as it's always being made out to be. You are a nuclear power. You are an occupation of the territory of several countries. You have the backing of the superpowers of today. You are financially wealthier and militarily stronger than all of your neighbors. There's no reason to play the victim card again and again and again. You have to wake up. Because ultimately, and Frank and I have had the discussion, well, we really are fearful that the manner in which things are going will lead to actual, severe anti-Semitism. And nobody wants to see that. Right now, anti-Semitism is being weaponized to target those who are critical of Israel and Zionism. But the manner in which Israel is behaving now, you can see it when Iran are dropping, missiles and they're hitting hospitals or indiscriminately attacking, something which nobody should be doing. But the reaction of the public is, well, they deserve it. Who's laughing now? Everything you've been gaslighting the world with for the past 20 months, you're now a victim of it. But no one has any empathy for you. No one has any sympathy for you. And that's a worrying place to be generally as human beings. Again, Israelis or Palestinians or Iranians, whoever they are, children shouldn't be targeted. Civilians should not be targeted. But that empathy is not there because of the manner in which Israel has behaved and the manner in which the Israeli public has supported, has entertained themselves. And I'm not saying all Israelis, but a significant proportion of them have made, mocking videos, reels, TikTok dances about the suffering of Palestinians. And now they are feeling it themselves. As for the Palestinians, my message is, firstly, forgive us for our shortcomings. Whatever we've done has not been enough. But what we do see is we see you. We see your pain. We hear your cries. We feel your suffering. And we see your humanity. We see your resilience, your resistance, your resolve. And we will fight to our dying breath to stand with you against whatever you face. And we're not afraid of what the consequences are. We're not afraid of who's going to judge us, because you are the inspiration to the entire world. If the people of the world had an ounce of the dignity of the Palestinian people, the world would be a much, much better place. And we respect that.
It's a really challenging question, and I find your answer really moving, Fahad. To Israelis, I would say a few things. I mean, Israeli is a complicated term, and there are, of course, Palestinian citizens of Israel who may not want to be Israeli. Some of them maybe, I don't know. And ultimately, I think the term Israeli should be consigned to history, right? I think that, like I said, I think the state of Israel should collapse. And so I suppose one of the difficult things that I'd encourage Israelis to think about is, what does it mean for you to let go of that identity, let go of this failed experiment in Jewish nationalism? So that's part of it. And then I suppose the second thing I would say is I would like to sit with the Holocaust, the Nazi Holocaust of Jews and communists and disabled people and so on in the middle of the 20th century. And that's not to censure it at a moment when Palestinians are facing a Holocaust, but it's to just acknowledge the extent to which the Holocaust is bound up in the justification for the Zionist project. And the question of Jewish security is presented disingenuously by the architects of the US empire and so on. They sort of suggest that the only way for Jews to be safe in the wake of the Holocaust is to have this little loyal Jewish Ulster. I would encourage Israelis to really reckon with the extent to which Zionism has totally failed to make Jews safer. What it requires is endless warfare for Jews to serve for 2 and 3 years, if not more, in a fascist regime, endlessly. And so what I'm encouraging Jewish Israelis to think about, and particularly Jewish Israelis who have experienced the trauma of the Holocaust, but it's important to remember a lot of Mizrahi Jews didn't experience the Holocaust, right? Or didn't experience it directly. But to those who do, whose Zionist identity is bound up with their relatives' experience of the Holocaust, no one is here to look away from that. No one's here to look away from the obscene trauma that Jews experienced in the Holocaust. The solution to the Nazi murder of Jews, because they were viewed as a racial impurity to a desired, German pure nation, is not to create a pure Jewish nation. It's part of the same problem. And I know that's really painful for Jewish Israelis to hear. In my opinion, it's literally part of the same problem. And I would encourage them to think deeply about what it means to walk away from that ethno-nationalism and towards something much more hopeful. As some of my comrades are fond of saying, the working class has no country. It really is possible to imagine yourself as part of a human family. And I think that's a much more hopeful way of living than this obnoxious experiment in Jewish nationalism. The final thing I'd say to Jewish Israelis is that it's okay to feel ashamed. I think a lot of Jewish Israelis probably do feel ashamed. The solution to shame is a complicated emotion. I think that Germans have a lot of shame. Not all of them. Some Germans have a lot of shame about what their parents and grandparents might have done under the Nazi regime. And I think it's turned Germany into quite a narcissistic and strange place. And we certainly see that in their response to this genocide, right? This kind of very narcissistic German brand of shame that says, well, I'm so ashamed of what my grandfather did that I'm going to endorse another genocide. So shame is a very tricky emotion. It fulfills a certain function, but if not put in its right place, it can become warped and disgusting, like German shame. And I suspect that a similar kind of shame is now very prevalent in Jewish Israeli society. Certainly that was my experience of it when I went there in 2019. I met a lot of Jewish Israelis, and some of the more fascist ones didn't seem particularly ashamed, but the more sort of liberal types seemed ashamed of the fact that their society was built on the rubble of Palestinian villages. And that is shameful. And people are very critical of Zionism for that reason. But the solution to shame is forgiveness. You have to seek the forgiveness of the Palestinian people and then atone, right? Do something to try to undo the damage, right? And you will never undo the damage, right? This genocide it's an indelible mark on the human family, but you should at least start, in my opinion, by sitting with how ashamed you feel and then thinking about what it would mean to respond to that in a way that's actually constructive, not the narcissistic reproduction of that shame. And to Palestinians, I mean, I don't think I can say anything more profound than what Fahad said. I suppose the only thing I would say is I personally wish that I had found a way to do more, but you are not alone. You will never walk alone. And we will never abandon you.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. There was so much in this conversation, and I really appreciate your time and the way you opened all of these doors and spoke also about your personal experience and perspective. So really, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to discuss with you. And again, thanks for your time.
Thank you very much.
Garmi Agat.